الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وأزواجه وذرياته ومن اهتدى بهديه إلى يوم الدين. تركنا على المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. ثم أما بعد. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord and Sustainer of the universe. We beseech Him and implore Him to forgive us and to offer His manifest blessings and salutations upon His last Prophet and our Master, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and on His kin, His companions, and all those who follow His guidance to the last day. He has left for us a clear, pristine path, its day as its night, its clarity, and all those who waver from it will only find perdition. So this is our sixth session, I believe, for the reading of the abridgment Mukhtasar of Imam al-Bukhari, and we continue in that. Today we start reading the Ahadith that al-Bukhari originally included in Kitab al-Ilm, or the chapter dealing with knowledge, and in it we'll find hadith that deal with the meritorious nature of seeking knowledge, the reward therein for those who seek knowledge, and some of the adab or etiquettes and customs that one should seek while seeking knowledge. So the first hadith, actually the second hadith will be Kitab al-Ilm. The first hadith, that was the completion of the last section, namely on the authority of Ibn Mas'ud رضي الله عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إذا أنفق الرجل على أهله يحتسبها فهي له صدقة. So here, narrated by Ibn Mas'ud, as we've mentioned about him before, he was from Ahl al-Suffah, from the people of the bench, and he was also amongst the prolific narrators of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And he was one of the most learned of the Sahaba, one of the most learned in terms of hadith, in terms of fiqh, and in terms of Quran. He also had his own Quran qira'ah, recitation, but it's not mutawatir, it's not something that has been passed down to us by many chains of transmission, so it remains a qira'ah shadha, or an exceptional qira'ah. But nonetheless, Ibn Mas'ud was well known, along with Ibn Abbas, for their understanding of the Quran and their ability to explicate the meanings of the Quran. And so may Allah be pleased with him, he narrates on the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that if a man spends upon his ahl, and I'll get to the word ahl in a second, يَحْتَسِبُهَا, anticipating and expecting therein a reward, فَهِيَ لَهُ صَدَقَةٌ, then this spending, the nafaqah itself, is a type of charity to be counted on his behalf. So this hadith has several things attached to it, also from a fiqh perspective, namely the idea of the nafaqah, and we see from the wording of the hadith the verb anfaqa, which means to spend, and this comes under the heading of wujub al-nafaqa, or the obligatory nature of nafaqa, of spending for the man in terms of the way of for his family. And the word ahl, that's also in this hadith, is used interchangeably to mean either merely the wife, or it could also mean ahl as in the wife and the children as well, or even other members of one's family. So both meanings are applicable and are used in the Arabic language. Now, in terms of nafaqah from a legal standpoint, one of the requirements for a man who is married, and in fact it's one of the preconditions before entering into a marriage, is that they should be financially able to support the wife. And that's the nafaqah. And being financially able to support the wife, some of it returns to custom, and some of it is things that are agreed upon So generally speaking, spending will be, in terms of basic needs, the basic needs are three, which all of the nations more or less agree upon: al-maskan, wal-malbas, wal-mat'am, or the three memes we can think of them, namely the maskan, the place where one lives, house, apartment, whatever it may be; wal-mat'am, what one eats; wal-malbas, what one wears to cover their nakedness. So these are the basic components, these are the basic aspects of nafaqah. So it's by consensus, it's the understanding of the ulama that a man or a husband who is married needs to spend at least in these three areas on the wife. And then there are additional things that return to custom or urf. So if it's generally acknowledged that if you're living in the UK, or you're living in the US or Australia, and generally people live in houses or apartments, then it's not, wouldn't be expected of you then to pitch a tent out in some grassy area somewhere and say this is the meskan, and then sort of expect your wife to live with you in that tent that you pitch out on the highway somewhere. And the reason for that, because the custom of the land is that people don't normally live out in tents out on the divider and the freeway or the highway. Some other places it might be. If you're in Mongolia and people are accustomed to living in yurts, then all you need to do is build yourself a yurt, and then that qualifies as the meskan, as the place where you can come and call a house and start a family from there. So these go back to the urf, the custom. And this is what is meant by the fuqaha in one of their fiqh principles that says al-'ada muhakkama, or al-'ada muhakkima, that the 'ada, the urf, the custom of people is taken into consideration when one is deriving legal rulings. And so to take the ayahs of the Quran or the Hadith out of their context, to find particular meanings based merely on the wording of the Hadith or the ayah in the Quran, or the nas or the text, and then to extrapolate from that and say, well, the Sahaba used to enter the masjid with their ni'al, with their sandals or their shoes, so it should be perfectly legitimate for me to enter the mosque that's tiled or carpeted with my shoes. But it's not, because you've stripped the meaning of the hadith or the ayah from the context in which it was originally revealed, and to do so would be a manifest error. And this is by the consensus of the ulama. Many of the ulama have written much about this concept of context, text and context, such as Imam al-Qarafi, Imam al-Shatibi, Ibn al-Qayyim Jawziyah, Imam al-Nawawi, amongst others, speaking about the danger of taking things out of their context and not taking into consideration the particular local circumstance. Now that doesn't mean that there's going to be a different sort of Islam, so to speak, from one city to the next, but what it does mean is that in matters such as these, when custom comes into play, when urf, people's expectations, so to speak, then it is considered. And there's another fiqh principle that they use, and they say al-'ada ka-shart. Al-'ada ka-shart. So the 'ada, the custom of a people, is like a condition. So if it's normally expected, for example, when entering into a marriage in a particular place, that the husband would buy the furniture, so to speak. In some places it's the opposite. Some places it's expected of the wife's family to buy the initial tajheez, or the furniture, which would include appliances and so forth, that would go into the home. So that's something that returns to custom. And so if there's no particular condition in the marriage contract stipulating one way or another who's going to pay for that, or who's going to be responsible for the wedding party, or for the tajheez, or the setting up of the house, so to speak, then it goes back to custom, and that might differ from place to place. But in terms of the nafaqah, what happens afterwards, then this is not a thing where we call custom, where the wife is generally pays. No, this is something that the Sharia is very explicit, and that the man, he is the one who is responsible for the upkeep and the upholding, financially speaking, of the house and of his wife. And then later on, if Allah blesses them with children, then also the children as well. All of that comes under the responsibility of the man. And he is not to expect that the wife would necessarily contribute to the upkeep of the house. Now, modern times dictate often that it's difficult to get by on a one-income household, so to speak. And in fact, there was definitely, after the 1950s, post-1950s in the U.S., when getting into the 60s, early 70s, that more and more homes were becoming two-income households. And of course, there's a whole history behind that, and it has to do a lot with the quote-unquote sexual revolution and more women entering to the workforce. But at least prior to the 60s and the 50s, at least, the standard was that there were one-income households, and people were pretty comfortable on that, and the man would be the one to work, and the wife would be the one who more or less would maintain the house and the children and so forth. But life, of course, has changed much since those times, and now we find that the system kind of is difficult to navigate without having, on occasion, two incomes, to have access to two incomes. But the Sharia still is pretty clear on this, that is not to be expected from the wife. If she does so of her own volition or accord, she wants to contribute, that's up to her, and entirely up to her, and she should not be coerced, she should not be put pressure on her to do such a thing, and so forth. And in fact, the idea of nafaqah itself, it's a precondition for marriage, as we stated, and it's also one of those things that is required for the marriage to actually remain valid in a sense. In other words, if the man finds himself in a difficult financial situation and he is no longer able to support the house or the wife or anything, she does have a right at this point to seek a divorce. And this could be done, can be effected via a court, an Islamic court, where the judge would look into the situation of the husband. And generally speaking, the fiqh books mention that he would be given some time to see if his situation will improve or not, usually about a year or so. And if it doesn't, then she has every right at that point to insist on a divorce if she feels that her life is becoming difficult and the man is unable to support her. So that's definitely a condition, and that would be a condition also for adding a second wife or a third wife, obviously, that one has to be financially able, have the nafaqah, to be able to maintain a house. And I'm aware of some of the practices of some of our brothers in some European countries especially, where they sort of don't really report the second wife, and the second wife, if she has children, then she applies for government funding, government benefits, because then at this point she's a single mother, and then she would be eligible for this type of thing. And I would say, from a purely, let's say, ethical perspective, it's a very dubious practice to enter something like that, to marry a second wife and then to avail oneself of government benefits, and knowing that situation even before you enter into the marriage. So even without looking at all the other requirements that are needed, especially when adding a multiple marriage, a second or a third wife, not just nafaqah, but also the equity and the equitable treatment between them, and also the taking into account the particular circumstance of your country that you're living in. If it's an illegal thing, and you'll be doing something illegal, then that's to be taken into consideration, because marrying more than one wife is not an obligation. It's something that's merely permissible. And so when you have something that's merely permissible at odds with the laws of a country that you're living in, then that has to be taken into consideration, because we are not technically ordered or commanded to do the permissible. The permissible is there for us to partake in, but we don't have to partake in it. So it's not something that we necessarily have to insist upon in order to practice our deen. So it wouldn't be considered part and parcel of the deen to have more than one wife. Now, obviously, notwithstanding, there are situations when it might be called for, especially increasingly now when marriage is more difficult to enter into, and there are fewer people who are actually able to support a wife and a house and so forth. But this has to be taken into consideration, has to be considered very carefully and very diligently before one actually enters upon such a scenario. And I think it would behoove him to also consult many people before even actually considering such a thing. And he should keep in mind that Imam al-Shafi'i radiallahu anhu, in his madhab, it's actually makruh. It's disliked to take on a second wife. But going back to the hadith, إذا أنفق الرجل على أهله يحتسبها, and we've seen this word يحتسب before in the previous hadith. I think we read it last week. من قام ليلة القدر إيمانا واحتسابا غفر له ما تقدم من ذنبه. Whoever stands for the night of power, ليلة القدر, إيمانا, with iman, واحتسابا, so it's the same word. In the previous hadith, it was in its masdar form, which is a verbal noun, and here it's in its verbal form, يحتسبها. It's actually a verb, but it is the same word and the same meaning, namely to have within the intention the expectation and the anticipation of the reward therein. And as I recall, we mentioned in the previous hadith that standing in prayer, generally speaking, is a rewardable action, is a rewardable deed. But you also, if you want to avail yourself of Laylatul Qadr, of the night of power, then you also have to have the ihtisab. And the ihtisab means that you're taking into account that it's Laylatul Qadr, or possibly Laylatul Qadr, and then you're also taking into account that ghufran al-dhanb, that the forgiving of sins, all of your previous sins could be a result of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepting your qiyam, your standing during the night of power, or Laylatul Qadr. So here, the infaq, spending up the man upon his family or his wife, both meanings are valid, and in this instance we would say family because he is also obligated to spend upon the children, and the ulama also mentioned that he is obligated to spend upon parents if they're unable to support themselves. So all of those come under the rubric of ahl, of the people that he has to maintain and support. So if he has ihtisab, if he is anticipating and expecting the reward therein for spending upon his family, then, right, jawab al-shart, the result of the conditional expression, فَهِيَ لَهُ صَدَقَةٌ, then it could be counted as a sadaqah, or a type of charity. So not only does he have the reward by fulfilling an obligation, but then there's the reward beyond that, which is the idea of that it can be considered a type of charity, a type of sadaqah. And the word sadaqah is used in the hadith text with different meanings. The meaning that most of us are accustomed to is the type of sadaqah or charity, giving out of your wealth beyond the zakat to those who are indigent or impoverished, or those who are in need. But it doesn't necessarily only mean that. Many of us are familiar with the hadith, ابتسامك في وجه أخيك صدقة. You're smiling to your friend is a type of sadaqah. Yani it's a type of hasana, it's a type of good deed, a type of good thing that you can engage in. And I would say it's particular to al-mu'amala bayn al-bashar. It's particular to dealings with people with each other. So that means that the dealings people have, especially with familiar relations or with other Muslims or even with non-Muslims, should be the mabda, the principle behind it should be one of benevolence, should be one of ithar, one of preferring your fellow human being over yourself. And so then if that relationship develops, then it can transpire and develop something that could be seen as a type of sadaqah, or good dealings when one even does something that's obligatory upon them, but nonetheless, if they do it in a beautiful way, in an equitable way, in a courteous way, with all of its adab, it can be a type of sadaqah. And Ibn Abu Jamrah, he also mentioned about this particular hadith, this particular obligation is also something, he said, where the benefit also returns back to the husband himself, because if he's spending upon his family, upon his wife, and she's maintaining herself with that money and so forth, so there's sort of a benefit for him in that as well. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His infinite grace and mercy, even when there's some benefit, worldly benefit, so to speak, dunyawi benefit that's coming back to you, nonetheless, the idea that it's a sadaqah, that it is a type of good deed and charity, will still, inshallah, be counted for you. And then he mentions the idea that this infaq, this nafaqah is due, is an obligation, whether you are in a particular circumstance where things are agreeable between yourself and your wife, or whether they are disagreeable. So that means that the withholding of nafaqah, the withholding of spending of that which is an obligation, is not to be used as a disciplinary tool, so to speak, or not to be used as a way to seek revenge, or to for someone's sort of perverted sense of putting one's wife in line and something like that. So withholding of sadaqah, or withholding of the nafaqah, of what you have to spend, is not a means by which to do it. Even if we look to the ayah in the Quran that deals with nushuz, which is recalcitrance between the husband and wife, there's no mention that says of withholding the nafaqah, or withholding spending upon the wife. And so that remains an obligation. And it remains an obligation even if the husband is not around, if, quote unquote, they are not in a position to actually be reaping the benefit or reward, so to speak. They're traveling somewhere. They still, if the marriage is to remain, they still have to spend the nafaqah. And it's interesting, one of the great ulama, Shaykh Abdullah ibn al-Qasim, who was one of the students of Imam Malik, he was in Egypt, and he was married, and his wife was pregnant at the time. And so he had studied with some of Malik's older students who had already went to Medina and come back to Egypt. But he had a desire to actually study with Imam Malik himself, anhu. So he told his wife that he's going to Medina, and he's not sure when he's coming back. So he actually gave her the choice between staying married to him or to seek a divorce. And she chose to maintain the marriage. And so he saw to it that the family received the nafaqah, that they were receiving a monthly allowance or expense to cover the household expenses. And even Ibn al-Qasim, he said about himself, he said, أنفقت 12,000 either dinaran or dirham, and I can't recall which, على العلم, that he spent 12,000 either dinars, which would be gold, or dirhams or silver, on ilm, on knowledge, from his own wealth. So that means what he left for his family, what he went to seek of knowledge in Medina. And he stayed there 20 years. And one time when he was in Hajj with Imam Malik, they were in their tent, and then this young man was around the encampment looking for Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim, and he asked, I'm looking for Ibn al-Qasim. And Ibn al-Qasim said, I am Ibn al-Qasim. And then the young man said, I am Abdullah, your son. So the boy that she was pregnant with back in those 20 years, he actually grew up and came and found his father there, and went seeking him. And then it wasn't much longer until Abdurrahman al-Qasim went back to Egypt, and he spread the teachings of Imam Malik. Of course, this is a rare example. We should keep in mind that it was done with the mutual agreement between Ibn al-Qasim and his wife. And looking at from a greater perspective, if he had not done that, then much of what we know of fiqh and what we know of the deen and what we know of the practice of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the people in Medina might have been lost or might have not have had the same khidmah or service done to it that a great scholar like Abdullah al-Qasim did for that knowledge. And it's said that he was amongst the best of Malik students. In fact, maybe the one who had the best memory and the one who preserved the traditions and the Hadith, like in al-Muwatta, and also he was the basis for Kitab al-Mudawwana, which is the primary source of Maliki fiqh, of Maliki law, as was Sahnun, who sat with Ibn al-Qasim and asked about all of these particular issues, masail, with Imam Malik, radiallahu anhum ajma'een. So I think for that hadith, that should suffice us. But I would mention one other thing, and that here, if we go back to the word yahtasib, anticipate, expect, whatever way we might translate it, may not do it justice. But nevertheless, we see that this ihtisab min al-a'mal al-qalbiyya. It's a deed or action of the heart. It's not a physical action, the physical deed. So we have a physical action deed here, namely the nafaqa, إِذَا أَنْفَقَ الرَّجُلُ. So the spending, that's something physical. And many people do that, both Muslim and non-Muslim. But then the idea of ihtisab, which is something dealing with the heart, this is what gives the action its relevance and its value. Without it, it's merely a deed, it's merely an action. Just like in the first hadith that al-Bukhari included in the whole Jamrah Sahih, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that actions are verily by intention. So these actions are sort of hollow and shallow without the intentions behind them. And like Imam Abdullah al-Secondary said that the a'mal, the actions are surun qa'ima. They are just merely shadows of something that doesn't have meaning without the secret. And he said the secret of it, or the spirit of the secret spirit within these actions, are ikhlas, are the sincerity in the intention behind them. So it takes sincerity of intention to reach this, I would say, a station or maqam of ihtisab. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. The next hadith, and this is the beginning of Kitab al-Ilm, and here, this, the way Bukhari narrated it, he says, al-Bukhari qal, and this is Ibn Abu Jamrah, because this hadith we're going to read now is actually min al-Hadith al-Mu'allaq, the Ahadith where al-Bukhari did not give a specific sanad in this specific instance. But the Hadith is Sahih, it was included by other Hadith narrators, and he was mentioned parts of it in other parts of Sahih al-Bukhari. But since he didn't mention it with a sanad here, then he didn't include it. So he says, al-Bukhari قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من يرد الله به خيرا يفقهه في الدين وإنما العلم بالتعلم. So Bukhari narrates on the Prophet ﷺ, and it's hadith mawsul, as we said, it's not munqata', it has a sanad. من يرد الله به خيرا يفقهه في الدين. Whoever Allah desires good, then He gives them understanding, fiqh, in the religion, with the fi الدين. And then another part, or another hadith, إنما العلم وإنما العلم بالتعلم, and that knowledge is gained by learning. And I'll explain it a little bit. So the first part, من يرد الله به خيرا يفقهه في الدين. So there's here an irada, there is a desire by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for good for us, for His slaves. And so this is important to consider, because many of us, we often look for signs or indications that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with us, and that's a good thing, that's a commendable thing, to want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with us, and to feel that we have some indication of that. And we often make the mistake that rewards in terms of dunya is one of the ways by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can show that He is pleased with us. It might well be, may not be, it may not be. Because dunya, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives it to whom He loves and whom He doesn't love. Right? يُعْطِي الدُّنْيَا لِمَنْ يُحِبُّ وَمَنْ لَا يُحِبُّ. He gives the dunya to those who are amongst the muqarrabeen, those who are made close to Him, وَالْأَوْلِيَاء وَالصَّالِحِينَ. And He also gives dunya to those people who are far away from that maqam. And so it's not an indication of itself by itself that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with you. Nor is it hirman, right, or deprivation of dunya specifically, an indication that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is displeased with you. Because if it was, many of the Sahaba and even the Prophet ﷺ, during aspects of his mission and his life, they had no dunya whatsoever. And even when it came to him, he left it, he abandoned, he forsaken it, he didn't seek it, he didn't desire. So the idea that reward should come in terms of material and ease of life in the dunya because we're being good Muslims and because we're following Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that's more grounded in delusion than it is in reality. And so here, in this hadith, we see the way, an indication of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with us. مَنْ يُرِدْ لَهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا. So when Allah desires good of us, يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ. He gives him fiqh. And here fiqh, not in the specialist sense of al-ahkam or the legal rulings of Islam, but more in the general sense of understanding of the deen. Understanding of course, obviously the hudud, the precepts and the concepts and what's halal and what's haram, but the idea of fiqh or understanding of the deen is not merely knowing the legal rulings, but it's also understanding, fahm, and that later translates into equitable dealings, and that's hikmah, that's wisdom. And so you need all three, or you need the first two components, namely the knowing, the knowledge itself, and then the understanding of that which you know, and then putting into practice of that which you know in the way that it was intended to put into practice. This requires hikmah, or wisdom. And so the meaning of fiqh, tafaqquh fi din here, encompasses all three, namely the knowledge itself, knowing the facts, so to speak, and the understanding of that, what it means, and then in addition to that, dealing or applying with hikmah, with wisdom. And so that's a true indicator, that's a true criteria for seeing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala desired good for us. For how many is the alim, how many is the practitioner and understander of the deen, someone who has no dunya whatsoever, but he has his deen and he has Allah's pleasure. But if you look at him or you look at her, you wouldn't think anything. And there's many hadith that talk about the status of such people, even if they are not known and if they are not sought and they don't have much of dunya, but nonetheless their maqam, their status with Allah is great. وَإِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ. And the second part of that, إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ, that knowledge or learning, which is ilm, بِالتَّعَلُّمِ, right? Our knowledge is sought or understood or transmitted. There's in the Arabic there's no verb here. This is a type of nano sentence or jumla ismiya, but the prefix that comes before it, or the preposition innama, they say adat hasr, and adat hasr means that you are saying learning or knowledge can only come by ta'allum. So ilm, there is no such thing as ilm without ta'allum. You don't have ilm unless you have ta'allum. And ilm is knowledge, and ta'allum is actually the process by which that knowledge is transmitted, is conveyed. And the ulama, they talked about this particular concept, and in the Islamic paradigm, we can even see that from the relationship that the Prophet ﷺ had with Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam, the archangel who brought the wahi, the revelation to him. And so there was a relationship there of ta'allum, right? And the hadith of Jibreel, the famous hadith of Jibreel, when he asked the Prophet ﷺ about Iman and Islam and Ihsan and Amarat al-Sa'a and the signs of the hour, and then Umar was asked by the Prophet ﷺ, Atadri, do you know who that is? And he said, Allah wa Rasuluhu a'lam. He said, Hada Jibreel atakum yu'allimakum dinakum. This is Jibreel who came to teach you, yu'allim, right, which comes from ta'allum, yu'allimakum dinakum, to teach you the matters, or to teach you your faith, or teach you your religion. So it has to be taught. In other words, there are certain conditions for knowledge transfer, knowledge transmission to take place, and one of those is the teacher. In fact, there's a famous maqula, famous phrase. They said there are 4 major components for knowledge transmission to be successful. They said Shaykh fattah, wa qutub sihah, wa aql rajah, wa madawat wa ilhah. So Shaykh fattah, the teacher, wa qutub sihah, that the knowledge itself is correct, it's proper, it's not something that's made up. وعقل ورجاح, right? Intellect, sound reasoning and intellect. And then the last, مداومة وإلحاح. المداومة والإلحاح means a talab, means you're actually seeking it and you are sincere in seeking it. And here مداومة and إلحاح means almost like an insistence, that one is tireless in their seeking of knowledge. And that's why they say العلم لا يعطيك بعضه حتى تعطيه كلك. That knowledge does not give you even some of its treasures unless you give it your all. So you have to go into it wholeheartedly. Knowledge doesn't like to have partners or mistresses. It wants to be the only one. It wants to be all that you're concerned and you are and the object of your desire and nothing else. It doesn't accept partners and distractions. And we see that many of the ulama, they even took this to the extreme and chose not to have families or get married so that they can devote themselves entirely to seeking knowledge. Amongst them were Imam al-Nawawi radiallahu anhu, and also Imam ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, amongst others, who chose not to get married. But there are others, of course, who did get married, and it goes back to the individual themselves. But the idea that to give it your all, to give knowledge your all, is something that is implied in this hadith. وَإِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ. And so we go back to the components of the of knowledge transmission. Shaykh fattah, in other words, a qualified teacher. And Shaykh fattah means he's also he's enlightened in of himself, and he can enlighten others. And he will not, or he or she will not be able to do that unless they apply that which they know. So there has to be ilm and there has to be amal. And so the modern concept of a sort of separation between the knowledge itself and then the person who is conveying that knowledge, as if their own ethics, their own morality, their own composition as human beings is irrelevant to what they teach, is something that's quite foreign, I think, to the Islamic paradigm. And bring Imam Malik as an example again. He was renowned for his insistence on choosing his teachers. And he said that he sat with some 900 of the ulama of al-Medina before he himself actually sat to teach others. And even there were certain ulama he would not sit with based upon something of wara', based upon something of scrupulousness. They didn't fall into a particular haram act, but he saw them do something that he thought wasn't la'iq, wasn't becoming of someone in that position, so he didn't sit with them, or he didn't seek knowledge from them. And so he took it very to heart about the idea of who you're taking your knowledge from. And it's also narrated upon him, amongst others, that he said, إِنَّ هَذَا الْأَمْرَ لَدِينٌ فَانْظُرُوا مِمَّنْ تَأْخُذُونَ دِينَكُمْ. That this amr, knowledge, is deen. It's your, we translate it as religion, but it's really the basis of your whole existence, of why you're here. So see, be careful about where you take this deen from, this knowledge from. And so the idea of having uh, qualified teachers is very important. And early on, originating in the study of Hadith, there was a system by which to confer upon people qualifications, namely the idea of isnad, right? The idea of isnad, which comes from the word asnada, or from sanad, that which is supports or supports you, that which is leaned on to support you. And so any alim or teacher worth his stock has to have some type of sanad. In other words, they have to have studied with others who took that knowledge also from qualified teachers and so on, either all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ in terms of things like Hadith and Quran, or back to the author of particular books, or people who studied with the author when we're talking about books of fiqh or books of theology, aqidah, or any of the other Islamic sciences. And so it was something that was insisted upon to have this idea of isnad, and the teacher would then, based upon his knowledge of the student, would confer upon him what's called an ijaza, as many of you are familiar with, which is just a qualification, and it's a permission or a license to say that he now has his confidence and he can adequately go and teach this particular subject or this particular book to others after him. And this Islamic paradigm, more or less, was very much intact up until the late 18th century. I would even say maybe into the mid 19th century, and then it started to break apart a little bit because of the shock of colonialism that happened across much of the Muslim world, including North Africa and Egypt and the subcontinent and other places. And so it still remains today, but it's definitely not like it used to be. And now we live in an age where seemingly knowledge is very accessible. All you have to do is get on the internet or put a search term into Google, and you could probably put some words of this particular hadith we're reading from right now in Arabic, put it into Google, and you'll find it somewhere. You'll find it, someone talked about it and what they said about it, and so forth. Or if you loosely translate into English, you also might find it. So there's this sense that knowledge is so easy and accessible, and so forth. But very clearly, إنما العلم بالتعلم. So I would say maybe facts, or I wouldn't even say facts, because facts means that they're true, but much data, data could be true or could be not true, so things either purporting to be true, or things that actually are true. You can have easy access to them via the internet and your search engines and Google and so forth. But the idea of ilm, right, and the transmission of that ilm, and to take it from someone who is he or she, himself or herself, is an inheritor, right, is an heir of the Prophet. Al-ulama warathatul anbiya, the scholars are the heirs and inheritors of the prophets, right? Because ma'ashar al-anbiya la yuwarithuna darhaman wala dinaran wala dirhaman, because the prophets, they do not leave behind gold and silver, but they leave behind their inheritance is this knowledge and this understanding of the deen, and ultimately how to go about and what informs you to live your life as a successful human being. That's what religion is. That's what the whole idea of the deen is. And so that can't be gleaned from a Google search, or on MSN.com or any of those places, or 1-800 dial a fatwa, or 1-800 dial a shaykh, and so forth. So there has to be a level of taharri, or a level of discernment when we're looking to see who we're going to take our deen from, who we're going to take our understanding from. And so that's quite important. Alhamdulillah, the Seeker's Guidance is one of those places where they have quite a few scholars that are being made available to people who have studied with ulama in the Muslim world, and even in the Western world as well, qualified scholars who then can impart what they have learned, and that's a fard, that's a fard kifaya. It's an obligation. So they're actually, in a sense, they are the brothers at Seekers Guidance and the sisters, they're they're holding up a communal obligation. If it wasn't for them, we might all be sort of in trouble. We might all be sinful, so to speak, because there's not too many people who are doing it. There's not too many people who are trying to make this ilm, this knowledge available. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yujazihum al-khair, that He rewards them immensely for all their efforts, and it's thankless work. It's people behind the scenes usually are not acknowledged all that often, but they're the ones who spend long hours, and they're the ones who are trying to bring you these accessible and available interfaces by which to interact with teachers and so forth. So we should all keep them in our dua and remind ourselves that Allah has servants that, even though not a lot of fame and popularity is attached to them, but nonetheless they have a great maqam, a great station with Him Azza wa Jal. So إنما العلم بالتعلم. So it's something that is sought or learnt via this transmission of knowledge, via the sanad, via the ijazah, things that I just mentioned. Now that doesn't mean that someone who goes and reads a book, and then gets some understanding from it, that they're totally, it's not to be considered, and they're outside of the understanding of this hadith. But there should be at least a requisite amount of knowledge to sort of understand what you're reading. And the problem is people go into it and enter into it, and they don't have the tools from Arabic language, from the basic mustalahat, the terminology. When you read something, like example, when we're reading this hadith, مَنْ يُرِدْ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ. So the word fiqh has a common understanding now. That's talking about legal rulings, but how do we know the hadith is not talking about that? Well, we know from the kalam al-ulama, from what the scholars have told us, and also that this idea of fiqh predates the terminology that came later on when fiqh was applied to legal rulings. So it couldn't have meant that specifically in that sense. So these are things that people hear from the ulama and that have been passed down. And our deen is mawruth. Our deen is the understanding of our deen is something that's inherited, unlike the post-enlightenment ideas that emerged in Europe, that every generation sort of have to figure it out all by themselves, and not to consider the traditions and what happened in the past. That's not our Islamic paradigm. That's not our experience. And also, by the same token, it doesn't mean that we are merely followers and copiers, and we are not to sort of make our own ijtihad and draw our own conclusions and so forth, and maybe reassess certain things. No, we are to do that, obviously, because every time and place is going to have particular circumstances. But there are certain thawabit, there are certain things that are intrinsic, inherent to the deen, that don't necessarily change over time. They're timeless principles that have to be mastered and have to be learned, and then those principles can be applied to the local circumstances in our everyday situations. Like Shaykh Ahmad Zarruq said in one of his Qawa'id al-Tasawwuf, one of his principles of Sufism, he said about the knowledge of the ancients, or the ones before us, قِفْ حَيْثُ وَقَفُوا ثُمَّ سِرْ. Stand where they stood, and then go, and then proceed. So in other words, avail yourself of their knowledge, of their understanding of all that has been preserved from them, and then you can proceed. Then you have something to proceed with. Then you have an understanding of the principles and the concepts, al-qawad wal-kulliyat, and then you can apply them to al-juz'iyat. Then you can apply them to specific circumstances and experiences and so forth. Wallahu a'lam. So the next hadith is similar to the one before, in that it's also mu'allaq, but also it's mawsul, has a sanad somewhere else. So al-Bukhari says, which he narrates on the Prophet ﷺ, مَنْ سَلَكَ طَرِيقًا يَطْلُبُ بِهِ عِلْمًا سَحَّرَ اللَّهُ لَهُ طَرِيقًا إِلَى الْجَنَّةِ. Whoever seeks or makes a path so that they can seek knowledge, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will facilitate a path for them towards paradise. So the hadith before this one was talking about how when Allah desires good for us, He gives us tafaqquh, or understanding of the deen, And here, this is talking about, well, what do we do when we understand that on our own behalf? Then نسلك طريقا. Then we try to find a path, a way by which to find that knowledge. So, and here the wording is interesting. من سلك طريقا يطلب به علما. Right? And so, سلك الطريق means that the tariq, or the road to it, may not be so easy, may not be so apparent right in front of you. And so there has to be some tasalluk, or there has to be some sort of figuring out where the road is, where the path is, because you're seeking that knowledge. And so the path to knowledge actually has never really been that easy. Many of the ulama, the whole rihla tradition, they would cross vast expanses of desert and difficult terrain merely for, or just to hear a singular hadith that someone had narrated that they heard about. And this happened often. And you hear about the exploits of some of our great ulama and how they traveled, and you think to yourself, you know, we have difficulty covering all those places by train and plane and car, let alone on mount, on a horseback or on camelback. So it's kind of even amazing to fathom how they actually were able to do this immense rihal, rihlat, you know, these trips that they made to seek knowledge. And they even had a certain discipline about them when they did go out and seek knowledge. They would not leave a particular place or qarya or town that they were in until they availed themselves, they exhausted all the possibilities for that which they could learn from that particular place, and then they move on to somewhere else. So it wasn't sort of a siyaha in the modern sense, or, you know, they're just taking in the sights and you know, just being tourists, so to speak. But actually, they stayed for, could be a matter of years, sometimes decades, before they even moved on to somewhere else. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, via the Prophet ﷺ, mentions in Hadith that if one seeks that path towards knowledge, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will also make a path easy for one towards paradise. And one might ask, why all of this emphasis on knowledge, on ilm? It seems to be the most important thing. And the reason for that is because it is the most important thing. Because without knowledge, without ilm, what informs your actions, what informs how you treat people, what informs how you govern countries and places and communities, and how you deal with your family, all of that has to be informed by knowledge. Because if it's not informed by knowledge, if it's not informed by ilm, it'll be informed by something else. And that, namely, that something else will be shahawat, will be dalal, will be miyul nafsiyya, you know, it'll be lower desires, it will be misguided approaches, it will be all sorts of things, everything except for ilm, except for knowledge. So if you're not being guided by knowledge, then most certainly you're being guided by something that's quite the opposite of that. So you, in essence, you'll be misguided. And so if everyone's running around treating everybody based upon faulty understandings of what life is really all about, and faulty understandings of reality, right? Because, you know, they define ilm, you know, the definition of ilm, they say idraku shay'i ala ma huwa alayh, right? Idraku shay'i ala ma huwa alayh, understanding or realizing something, conceptualizing it. All of these mean the Arabic term idrak, ala ma huwa alayh. So conceptualizing, understanding, fathoming, ascertaining, percepting, whatever you want to call it, a thing as it is, as it exists in reality. As it exists in reality. So that means, one, that there is a singular reality. It's not relative. My reality is the same as your reality. It's not, they're not two different things. The sun sets for me like it sets for you. It's the same reality. We look up in the sky and we see the same sky, all of us. We look to ourselves, and we're all human beings created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that reality is one. It's not a relative thing. So since it's not something that is relative, that means it can be known. And it can be known, and we can agree upon it, because it's not relative to one particular place or circumstance or person. Um, and so that being the case, this ilm then informs us of how to deal with that reality. First, understanding it for what it is, and then dealing with it. And part of the ilm that we're talking about here, and much of it, when we say al-ilm al-shar'i, for example, when we say sharia knowledge, uh, another word for sharia knowledge is ilm that is understood, or that is its source is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Because knowledge can be gleaned from other sources, mainly two other sources that the scholars of theology talk about, either al-aqliyat wal-adat. Al-aqliyat are those things that are known or discernible, what they call in logic a priori knowledge, or what can be discerned by any human being. You know, knowing 1 plus 1 equals 2. You don't really need evidence, someone to convince you. It's sort of something that it's inherent knowledge. And these are things like knowing that a larger vessel can't fit into a smaller one, knowing 1 plus 1 equals 2. This is called type of aqli, or things that can be discerned by one of sound intellect, and it's something we'll all agree upon. 1 plus 1 will not equal 3 for you and then equal 2 for me. It'll always equal 2 for everybody. And then al-adat, those things that can be known experientially. In other words, we've seen it happen at least twice or 3 times, and so we know that when you light a match and you put it to a piece of paper, it burns it. And so that is known from things that are known by experience. And much of what people call knowledge today, they claim comes from this particular source, or scientific knowledge, that which they can understand experimentally or via experimentation. And that's their primary source, if not only source, for much of the world who are not in tune to the divine essence in the world itself. And then al-ilm al-shar'i, or ilm al-wada'i, sometimes called, is that which comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that means the one we mentioned before, ilm that has come from adat or experience, is limited to al-mahsus. It's limited to only those things that are observable or appreciated by our senses, by sensory perception. And that's why people tend to disavow or totally disregard anything that cannot be perceived or observed. So they don't call it knowledge. So we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we believe in the angels, we believe in the prophets, we believe the Quran is Allah's speech as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are things that are necessarily observable in the common sense that people apply. But nonetheless, they are haqa'iq for us. They are in fact the epitome of reality. And so to say that they're outside of reality because we can't perceive them or observe them, that's a notion that is very unique and specific to the modern mind, and especially the modern scientific mind, so to speak. And you don't have to necessarily be a scientist to buy into that, but the idea of this particular understanding of how we perceive our reality is something that's pervading. So not only scientists, but all people in all walks and sorts of life, they also buy into it. But someone who is a person of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a person who believes in not just the seen, right, but the unseen, right, that's what defines you as who you are, and it defines your understanding of reality, right, because the Quran says, الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ, those who have yu'minun, and here yu'minun, you can say believe in it, but iman, they say tasdeeq, so it means holding something to be true and as being part of reality. So in other words, we're saying that which is ghaib, right, ghaib an al-hawas, that which is imperceptible by our senses, nevertheless is haqq, it's real, and it's as real as something that we can perceive by our senses. Why else would Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, he would say, لو وضعت الجنة والنار أمامي ما ازددت يقينا. He said, if I actually now had sensory perception, actually saw paradise and hellfire before me, I would not increase in my certainty of their existence. Why? Because he had iman bil ghaib. He already understood that they exist nevertheless. He didn't need that extra certainty that we think we need by actually seeing them متمثل, يعني seeing them actually before us. And we'll get to a hadith later on, next week I think, a hadith of Asma about the Prophet ﷺ, of how he saw paradise and hellfire, and he described this to them, and this was right after the inshiqaq al-qamar, right after the khusuf, right after the eclipse of the sun. So going back to the hadith, then the ilm itself, al-ilm al-shar'i, is something that is muktasab, it's something that can be sought and earned from its proper sources, namely warathat al-anbiya, who are the heirs and inheritors of the prophets, and they in turn are the ones who took it from the ones before them, all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ, who took it from Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam, min Rabbil Izzah, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And just to close, there's also another type of knowledge that is not meant in these ahadiths per se that we're talking about here, sometimes referred to as al-ilm al-ladunni, or knowledge and understanding, realizations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can send to people, that he can avail them of these understandings based upon his infinite mercy and his rahmah, to whom he pleases and to how he pleases, right? And many of them, they mentioned the ayah in Surah al-Baqarah, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ. So having taqwa can be a precursor to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaching you and giving you knowledge of things that you do not know. And I think in the next hadith about the Prophet ﷺ talking about huwa al-qasim wallahu al-mu'ti, that the Prophet ﷺ is the distributor of knowledge and Allah is the mu'ti, he is the true giver. We will get more into that particular concept, but I see that we've gone about an hour now, so I will stop here and take questions if there are any, inshallah. I see that question about Ibn Mas'ud. You're right, it does say Abi Mas'ud. Yeah, my mistake. I actually read it Ibn Mas'ud. The hadith, the first one, on Abi Mas'ud, and his real name is Uqba ibn Amr, and he was Ansari Khazraji, and he participated in the Battle of Badr. So it's actually rated upon Abi Mas'ud, not Ibn Mas'ud. So apologize for that mistake. Question Hadith 9. What would you advise students to focus on or specialize in our era in terms of fiqh versus hadith? It seems that muhaddithin are few and there are more muftis, but also fiqh seems to be more direly needed. All of the ulum, all of the disciplines are needed in a sense. They're all are a type of fard kifaya, but there is a particular aspect of hadith now that there was more of a need for it in the past and less so today. Namely the idea of verification or tasheeh, verifying whether hadith is sahih or hasan or da'if and so forth. Having that particular skill of al-ta'dil wa tajrih, yani of determining if a particular narrator is adil or majruh, if he is someone who's a thiqa or a trustworthy narrator or otherwise. And so there are many books of the tabaqat of the muhaddithin, Imam al-Dhahabi and others who spoke about this and sort of have done all of that background work more or less, and then others came, and Bukhari and Muslim And we even see here during the time of Ibn Abu Jamrah, we're reading his Mukhtasar, and he took out most of the sanad, save for the Sahabi, based upon the fact that the ummah has accepted the Hadith of Imam al-Bukhari and Muslim and others, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, and the other Hadith collections. And so that means that if it has been accepted, there's less of a need to actually go over and analyze it once again and verify its veracity or its sihha. We don't have to take the Hadith in Bukhari again and determine whether it's really sahih or not, because we're never going to reach a level that Bukhari reached. But in terms of of fiqh is a science that needs to adapt to the local circumstances that one finds themselves in, and also fiqh, inherent in the fiqh, is something called tahqiq al-manat, which means that determining if a particular fiqh ruling, does it actually apply to this specific case or it does not. That's a skill in of itself which very few people have. And most of the mistakes in fatwa, or I would say many of the mistakes made in fatwa, are based upon this, that there is two types of mistake that often accompany each other: khata fi tasawwur wa khata fi tahqiq al-manat. So khata fi tasawwur means a mistake in the actual conceptualization of what the problem is, of what the scenario is. And so when the mustafti, the one who's asking fatwa, describes the situation to the mufti, it's likely to be biased or missing things and so forth. And if the mufti is not skilled enough to extract from the mustafti, the person asking the fatwa, all of the relevant information that he or she needs in order to determine legal ruling, then an erroneous legal ruling is more than likely. In addition to that, once they have all the relevant information, the ability to take that relevant information and then to determine, well, that particular ruling I read about in that fiqh manual, whether Hanafi or Maliki or Shafi or Hanbali, does it apply in this situation or not? And not only that, I have access to other madhahib in this particular person. Should I give them the ruling of Malik on this, or Shafi'i, or Ahmad ibn Hanbal, or otherwise? And that you have to be able to determine, well, what's best for that person there. You might give them a hukum, especially if it's something after the fact. If they tell you, I've been praying for 20 years and I figured out that actually the qibla was wrong and it was off by 45 degrees, or let's say 40 degrees, it was always been off. On a particular madhab, if we take the nas of the madhab, if we take the actual, text as it is, they might have to redo all their prayers. But another madhab might allow it. That's a leeway. If they made ijtihad and determining the qibla and they made a mistake, then after the fact, their prayer is accepted. So the idea for the mufti is not to make life difficult for people or to give them the most difficult ruling to follow. It's to give them a way to follow their deen in the best way that they can. So that whole idea of understanding a fatwa, which is more than just reading a book of fiqh with a shaykh, it goes beyond that. I think, as the questioner mentioned, we're in dire need of that, very much so. Question about Hadith 10. Why did Imam Ibn Abi Jamrah use the mu'allaq narration? Hadith 9, right before this one, when it's part of the narration, anyway, the part about Allah giving understanding. Because Bukhari included in his chapter heading, it was already there, the first one, Kitab al-Ilm, and then that was the chapter heading that was there. So he included it there, and then in the next hadith, number 11, it is there as well, but al-Bukhari, he himself included it in both places. Also in my copy it says next to the Mu'allaq Hadith 9, Masilat al-Jazm, I think, is that what you're saying? What does that mean? I think that means that the hadith, uh, the ninth one, it's a conditional phrase. So من يريد الله به خيرا. So here yurid is actually in a majzoom state. It's فعل مجزوم because it is فعل الشرط. So من هن من الشرطية. من, the word من can be شرطية or it could be من الموصولية. So it could mean من الذي. So it could have been من يريد الله, but here it's شرط, so it's saying it's a condition. So that means the verb is شرط. من يريد به خيرا يفقهه. So that's also in a jazm state, يعني سكون on the ayn lam al-kalima, which is the qaf. So the whole sigha is sigha al-jazm. In other words, it's a conditional phrase. Wallahu alam. I don't have your book, your particular version in front of me, but that's what I think it means. About acting what you know, is it wrong to teach something you do not implement, or learn from a sin that you self-commit? One understanding I've heard is that the act sin is a separate act. Yeah, I mean that's an understanding, but if we went by the idea that everything that we can convey to people we have to be in ourselves implementing perfectly and completely, then there would be no amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. No one would be advising anyone else because no one is perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. But obviously, the idea is not that you stop. If you know something, a particular thing, advising about it, it's you have to work harder to implement it yourself. The easy way out would be say, well, I'm not doing it myself, so I'm not going to talk about it. No, you say, I have to be doing it myself, so I will implement it myself. Imagine asking, how would we know who is in the correct understanding of religion? Doesn't that seem funny to ask any imam for the sanad? You can find out about a particular teacher's sanad or lack thereof without asking them directly. If you're going through a channel like Seeker's Guidance and so forth, and they have the bios of the teachers there and who they studied with, and that type of thing. Just in the same way, none of us would go to the clinic or the hospital or the doctor, the physician, and sort of not have some level of comfort and confidence that this person knows what they're doing. If we ask them, and usually they have their degrees up on the wall behind them in their desk. And then if we were to ask them, so what did you study? And suppose they didn't study anyone, they said, well, I read Gray's Anatomy, I read a few books. I feel pretty confident I can remove your appendix. No one's going to stick around for that. So if we have this at least level of discernment with our bodies, then what about our deen? Afwan Shaykh, any recommendations on how to attune ourselves to the people connected to Allah so we don't pass by them and miss them entirely? Well, the thing is, you really don't find them, they find you. The people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah knows who they are, and if Allah desires good for you, right, and desires to give you fiqh and understanding of the deen, and then إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمْ, that means He's going to take you to the person who's going to enlighten you, the person who's going to bring your deen forward or to a different step. And so that means you have to be sincere in your talab. You have to be sincere in seeking that. And if you are, you'll find it. And know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He answers the dua, but in the way that He perceives is best for you, and in the time and when He perceives is best for you. And so, and in the dua, you should have this sort of making the dua, insisting upon it, and not rushing the result. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will determine when it's best for you for that to happen. Allah A'lam. I guess that's all the questions for this week. I thank everyone who tuned in. Hopefully the other sessions will be up on YouTube for those who have missed it. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us understanding of this deen, and be of the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala desires good for, and to make us from His ibadullah al-khalisin, from His sincere servants, and that He lift the trials and tribulations that many amongst us in the ummah are going through right now, and that He gives us thabat, gives us constancy, and makes firm our feet in the faith and our practice of the deen, and our actions towards our families and towards our wives and husbands and children and our parents, and that He make us amongst those who on their last breath they say La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, and He gives us the true meanings, and that we imbibe the true meanings of that shahada. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.